And welcome back. If you attended our first session, this is the second session of our 12th annual Fall Ethics Symposium on the ethics of saying things. I'm going to begin this session with just a brief announcement. If you have found a black high-tech backpack, the backpack isn't high-tech, the name, the kind of backpack, it's called high-tech. If you found it, if you see it, you should turn it into the people at the back desk. Thanks very much. The second session will go much like the first. We have a main speaker, and then we have a panel offering very brief comments immediately following the main talk. After that, me and a helper will come round to you asking for your questions. On the panel, our main speaker is Jonathan Miles. Jonathan Miles is an associate professor of philosophy at Quincy University in Illinois. He teaches applied ethics, including medical ethics, business ethics, and political philosophy. His work centers on the intersection of epistemology and ethics, especially as it pertains to virtue theory. He's published on freedom of speech and pornography and international blasphemy laws in academic journals. He's currently writing a medical ethics textbook. We also have Elizabeth Nolan Brown, who is an associate editor at Reason magazine. She covers issues related to policy, culture, and current events. Tom Cushman is professor of sociology at Wellesley College. He's currently editor-at-large of the Journal of Human Rights, and he's the director of the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. And finally, our panel is rounded out with Casey Campbell. Casey is a tenured associate professor at Pierce College, teaching microeconomics, macroeconomics, and related economic theory courses. She specializes in economic theory and policy analysis. She earned a PhD in economics and management from Claremont Graduate University in Pomona, as well as a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Southern California, bachelor's degree in Economics Management Studies and Political Science from the University of West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. So that's the order in which you'll hear from them, and all we need to do now is welcome Professor Miles.
Yeah, thank you. So I usually am accused of keeping people awake in other classes. That's how loud I talk. So I'm going to just stay away from this thing as much as I can. But somebody just let me know if you can't hear me, okay? And we'll go from there. So I'm going to talk about free speech and Title IX culture. The key idea being culture here, and that's a loaded term, so I'm going to talk about it. But here's my argument in a nutshell. Well, first, that's a nutshell, but then here's my argument in a nutshell. My argument is that the current campus speech wars is really a clash of cultures, okay? And I'm going to talk about each of those cultures. The two cultures are what I call Title IX culture and what I call 1A culture. Just trying to keep the similarity between the two terms to make them shorter. And my claim is going to be that Title IX culture cannot coexist with 1A culture. Okay? 1A culture, what I call First Amendment culture, is deeply skeptical about regulating viewpoints. Title IX culture is much more confident about regulating viewpoints. Skepticism is the morally justified position. That's what I'm going to try to convince you. That's my job. Okay? So the first two of those claims will involve just kind of unpacking. The third one is going to be an actual philosophical argument. And I'm going to look at two of what I think are the strongest arguments in favor of regulating viewpoints. Okay? Regulating what people say in terms of what their viewpoints are. And then I'm going to argue that you ought to be skeptical of policy that comes out of those two claims, okay? Those two arguments. There is a worry here, though. And that worry is that non-compliance, the costs of not complying with Title IX culture, are much higher than the costs of not complying with First Amendment culture. In other words, if a university does not acknowledge, respond appropriately to a Title IX complaint, they can lose their federal funding. As of Grove City v. Bell, a Supreme Court case many years ago, Title IX has been attached to university funding. They can lose their federal funding. If, however, a university violates someone's First Amendment rights, they will go to court. The court will strike down the speech code or whatever it is. There may be civil damages. There could be, the student could sue. That certainly has happened on a couple of occasions. However, there is no loss of funding for the university unless there is a payout. Now, given that universities operate on money, there is going to be a very real incentive to comply with Title IX culture and not First Amendment culture. In other words, the First Amendment's never going to win. Now, some caveats, because I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to define my terms, right? So caveat number one, Title IX culture, not Title IX. Okay, here's the words for Title IX. I believe it's 37 words long. Okay? No person shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to the discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal assistance. That's Title IX. Okay? And I agree with the American Association of University Professors, which says, there is no necessary contradiction between effectively addressing problems of sexual harassment, and that includes assault, inappropriate conduct, and unprotected speech, like threats, right? Things of that nature, and fully protecting academic freedom. So for those of you that are vegetarians and vegans, I apologize. My beef is not with Title IX. Okay? My beef is with Title IX culture. How did we get from discrimination to certain kinds of censorship? How did that occur? And I want to kind of give you an idea of how that happened. And to do so, I need to look at my notes. Title IX is designed to protect campuses from discrimination and harassment. That was one of the first things it did. First, it was about sports equity, and then the Office of Civil Rights came in, and it became about discrimination and harassment. Title IX creates a process to make charges of harassment through campus administration and can punish noncompliance by restricting federal aid. Okay? That led to a discussion of what sexual harassment is. And I could go into all the court cases, and we could look at all of the Dear Colleague letters that came from the Office of Civil Rights, and I wish I had time to do all of that, but you all just ate, and I don't want you to fall asleep. Okay? But suffice it to say that essentially sexual harassment was defined as a hostile environment, including a hostile environment, okay, which is conduct that is severe or pervasive enough to create a work environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. Okay, that was the standard from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Interestingly enough, the court case that solidified this said that a hostile environment is one where the conduct is severe and pervasive. That was the Supreme Court case, Grove City versus Bell. And it was severe and pervasive. The Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, in their Dear Colleague letter in 2011, said severe or pervasive. Now, you think that little word, and or, would make a big difference. But it does. Makes a huge difference. And what it said was that anything that was severe enough to cause a hostile environment, and your hostile work environment is this campus, then it was a violation of Title IX or Title VII. If it was involving race or national origin, it was Title VII of the American Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If it involved gender, it was Title IX. Students began to consider exposure to hateful viewpoints to be abusive. And so they seek out authorities to regulate, to regulate that hostile work environment. Because Title IX schools have, and as of another Supreme Court case, which we refer to as Davis, all schools are affected by Title IX. Anybody that gets federal financial aid, and name a university that doesn't. Schools have financial incentive to protect students from a hostile work environment, not from First Amendment expression. And that's how we got from discrimination to censorship. That's how it occurred. Okay? And you get things like this, investigation in a box. The toolkit from the Association of Title IX Administrators. Everything you need to effectively investigate Title IX complaints all in one package. Becomes a kind of industry. So, 1A culture, so I want to be clear, my beef is not with Title IX. My beef is with how we got from Title IX to a particular culture that looks at censorship as an acceptable sort of thing. I'm not also interested in the First Amendment. I know. For the First Amendment only applies to public universities. I know the First Amendment only applies to what government does. I get that. However, First Amendment culture is something that is in clash with Title IX culture. And First Amendment culture is a little bit different than the First Amendment. Here's the First Amendment. It's 45 words long. First Amendment culture is something entirely different. Okay? Now, you might be asking yourself right about now, what do you mean by cultures? Right? Suspicious dog is suspicious. Especially since I'm sharing a panel with some sociologists, one in the audience, too, several of you possibly involved in sociology. I get myself into trouble because I'm a philosopher and I'm practicing sociology without a license. But I'm going to do my best, and I will allow my colleagues to correct me where I am wrong. But there are 3 definitions to Merriam-Webster Dictionary on the word culture. By the way, the word of the year last year was the word culture, which has been a word around for a long time, but it seems to be the one everybody is dealing with. So one definition is culture is a process of individual enrichment. Right? We talk about being cultured, right? Which means that you watch PBS along with watching Netflix, right? So you watch the new streaming, Punisher on Netflix, and then you also watch, the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, and you are cultured. Okay, that's one of the definitions. The second definition is just simply a group's way of life. Boy, can you get any more vague than that, right? It's just the way of life of a group of people. The third definition is culture as an activity pursued by means of institutions. I also have an economist on this panel, so she can correct me about institutions also, right? So what am I after? I get to use the there we go. I'm primarily interested in these 2. This, we could talk about funding for the arts and all that sort of stuff, if you want to over coffee. But I'm interested in these 2 down here. Culture as a way of life and culture as an activity pursued by the means of institutions. By the way, if you're interested in this, Joshua Rothman has the meaning of culture in the New York Times. This was after the word culture came out as the word of the year. And he has a really fascinating article about what we mean by culture. And he agrees that these 2 right here, culture as a group's way of life and activity pursued by means of institutions, are the 2 that we're really interested in. So when we talk about, oh gosh, I'm going to blind somebody. I apologize. It won't go off. Just have to holster that thing. Okay, there we go. So when we talk about this, I don't mean this in any disparaging sense of the word, but there is another use of the word culture, and you biology majors know what I'm talking about. You culture something, right? You grow it, and it kind of grows on its own, doesn't it, in a particular kind of environment. So it looks a little bit like this, right? And those kinds of cultures, this could be penicillin for all I know. I just pulled it off of Google Images. It could be, it could be Ebola. I have no idea. But the point is that it is an order, but it is spontaneous. That is, no one person directed it in any way, but it does have its own kind of life, doesn't it? I'm going to suggest to you that what I mean by Title IX culture and what I mean by 1A culture is like that. It's what F.A. Hayek called a spontaneous order. It is something that developed as an order. It has its norms, it has its customs, it has all of those sorts of things, and yet nobody centrally planned it. Okay? The reason that I can say that about Title IX especially is I just read an article 2 days ago that in London, and I believe it was at Oxford University, there is now a new job description. You can get a job at London as a safe space marshal. That is, whenever there are talks on the university campus, there are people that make about $10 an hour US, and their job is to be a safe space marshal. They walk around, they protect the audience from the speaker, and the speaker from the audience. And they basically try to maintain a certain kind of order. And there's all kinds of questions about that. London, England Great Britain has no sort of Title IX. It has the Public Order Act, which has kind of become its way of dealing with hate speech, but it doesn't have anything like Title IX, and they've already created a job for this that gets paid as well. So this kind of culture has its own norms depending on where it is. So I'm going to give a working definition of culture, and I'm going to allow my sociologist friends to criticize me on it later. A culture is defined by a group's dispositions, that is, its activities, assumptions, and attitudes, embodied in its institutions. Okay? So it's its activities, its attitudes, and its assumptions embodied in its institutions. And I'm going to argue that First Amendment culture, what I call 1A culture, has its institutions, and Title IX culture has its institutions. So let's start with the 1A culture. Why? Because it's older. It's been around longer. Okay? 1A culture has certain activities. 1A culture, the First Amendment culture, the thing that separates the United States, according to Jeremy Waldron, the political philosopher, says the United States is exceptional in its defense of the First Amendment, right? He's not talking about First Amendment law. He's talking about this culture, right? When we say that the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment have never had a fair fight in this country, right? Then what we're talking about is not the law, we're talking about the culture surrounding it. And so the activities involved in 1A culture, I'm going to argue, is something called principled tolerance. That is, tolerating someone else not because of them, but because of your own moral belief that tolerance is a good, that tolerance is a virtue, for example. I wish I had time to get into all of that because I really am interested in the idea of tolerance as a virtue, but that's certainly the activity here. A principled restraint. That is, it is not merely in a Title IX culture, in a 1A culture, that I am ignoring what Tom is doing. I'm principally tolerating what he's doing, and I think I'm doing something too, right? That this is an activity. It's not merely an ignoring of what you're doing. I might do it by trying to persuade you. I might try doing it by counter-protesting. I might do lots of things of that nature. But I'm engaging in a principled tolerance, an active criticism of ideas. What are the attitudes of 1A culture? Skeptical of viewpoint regulation. To quote Robert Jackson, who was a Supreme Court Justice, if there is one fixed star in the First Amendment, it is that no official, high or low, shall decide which viewpoints shall be expressed. right? The Supreme Court has a really weird history with the First Amendment, right? We have all kinds of questions about time, place, and manner restrictions, like can we use a bullhorn, or can I do it in front of the classroom, or can I do it in the classroom, or can I march down the middle of the street, or whatever. But the one thing that the court has agreed on is that it is worse to censor content. That is, we're not going to have any political speech in this room, right? That's bad. That's worse than saying if you want to do political speech, you got to do it out there, right? But even worse than that is what we call viewpoint regulation. That is not, we're not going to have any political speech, but we're not going to let any of those political people speak. We're not going to let those viewpoints be heard. We're not going to let those sentiments be expressed, right? And the court has been united historically about that, about not regulating content. We are very skeptical in 1A culture about regulating viewpoints. As panelists, if you were here for the first talk, somebody was talking about regulating hate speech, and the response unanimously from the panel was, who gets to decide? That's a 1A culture kind of attitude, right? We are skeptical of any official, high or low, making those decisions for us, okay? Assumptions. We'll go back to Tom's talk about the agora a little bit. The assumption is an agora of unregulated sentiment and opinion. The assumption is that when you walk outside into a public area, you can expect to be confronted with ideas that you despise, ideas that you don't like, ideas that you may just be annoying, or ideas that may be offensive, and so forth. And so that's the assumption in 1A culture, all right? That we are going, if I walk through the airport, I don't know if they have regulations against this here, but walking the airport down in New Orleans, where my wife is from, I can expect outside, I might get a pamphlet, I might get a flower from a Hare Krishna occasionally, I might get, all of these sorts of things. I can expect that to happen, maybe not at the airport, but at least if I walk down the street in the French Quarter, right? I'm going to be confronted with ideas I don't like, lifestyles that I might, that are going to be something different than I'm used to, whatever. And I'm expected to principally tolerate it. I'm expected to do something. This is a picture from Hyde Park in London. Hyde Park is the one place in London where you can speak freely. They have parousia pretty strongly at Hyde Park. And people can walk down the middle of Hyde Park and they can hear all kinds of different viewpoints. Everything you could possibly imagine. And you can participate too. Bring your own soapbox. You bring your own soapbox, you set it up there next to the fence, you stand up and say whatever you want to. Right? So that's the assumption. This is a picture of 1A culture. That's what 1A culture looks like. All right? Title IX culture has its own attitudes, activities, and assumptions. Here's the first one. And it was reflected in some of the Q&A that we got from our first talk. Stop interfering with my freedom of speech. The assumption here is that this guy's megaphone is bigger than this little guy here, right? Free speech is a zero-sum game, and some people can monopolize through power, through money, through whatever, right? Through privilege. They can monopolize the discussion. So it isn't an agora. It is, in fact, a situation in which money, power, or privilege can determine who has the megaphone. That's the assumption. Okay? So activities of Title IX culture. Activism. Lots of campus activism. Right? Advocating for marginalized voices. Voices that are the little guy down here. Advocating, protesting for those people to be heard. Okay? Attitudes. Confidence in hate speech regulation. This, if you don't get anything else out of my talk, get this. There's a lot of data that indicates that students at the end of high school, first 2 years of college, have a lot of confidence in our ability to distinguish between offensive speech, which they are unanimously and overwhelmingly in favor of. Offensive speech, offensive ideas, absolutely. Uncomfortable learning, I'm all for. And there is a bright line between that and hate speech. And we can make that distinction. There, in 1A, Title IX culture says that we can distinguish between offensive speech and hate speech in a confident, clear way, that can be done. That's the attitude. Confidence in hate speech regulation. The assumptions are skeptical of tolerating speech. It must be regulated so that some don't have more than others. Now, if you look at these two, so there's that investigation in the box, right? So if you look at these two, you can look at the clash here. Okay? I want to make my point. Like, Okay. Here we go. So here are three big ideas. These three big, those of you taking notes, you have to take notes because you have to write that paper, that thing, so you get the points that you want. I know, I do it too. I appreciate the professors who, subsidized my talk. These two right here, principled tolerance for all ideas, activism, not restraint for the marginalized, these two, I think, may be able to coexist. I really do think this is possible. I think that you can have a 1A culture with a lot of activism for marginalized voices. I don't have a beef with these two, okay? But these two and these two cannot coexist, and one of them is going to win. Okay? Skepticism about, you're either skeptical about viewpoint regulation, about deciding between offensive speech and hate speech, or you're confident about regulation. You're confident that someone can draw those lines. Maybe you, maybe someone else. First Amendment culture, you're confident in tolerance, more speech, uncomfortable speech. Tom was mentioning that the idea that the best way to handle offensive and hateful speech is more speech, uncomfortable speech, right? Protest, counter-protest, all sorts of things to this nature, right? Title IX culture says skepticism of tolerance since it leads to inequity, okay? These two can't both be right, I don't think. Now, they could both be wrong, and there could be a third option. I did teach logic, but they can't both be right, I don't think. I think they're making counterclaims here, and these two are making them as well. I don't think this is necessarily. I think we could find room. I think we could coexist here. Because I do think marginalized voices need to be enhanced. I think that's true. But these two, we're going to have a problem. And so and I would like to point out something. I'd like to point out something. I'm almost afraid to turn it on now. No, that's a big reveal. Stop! Stupid! Out, gremlins! What is going on? Why can't I go back to my slide? I'm not ready for this one yet. For those philosophers, man, I'm telling you. Okay, there we go. I'm not even going to touch this. I'll just point. I don't want to do that anymore. Why is Title IX culture confident about people being able to divide that line between offensive speech and hate speech? Because you have to do it yourself all the time. Lots of studies indicate FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, just did a pretty extensive survey called Speaking Freely. You can Google it. And they did a survey of like 2,500 college students. And what they found out is that college students are really, really comfortable self-censoring. We do it all the time. College students censor themselves in class and outside of class. So it's not just that they censor themselves in class, where there could be issues with the curriculum and things like that, but they censor outside of class. So we're doing it already. We're deciding that for ourselves. This is offensive, or this is hateful, and I'm not going to say it, or this is offensive, and I'm not going to say it because of the situation, all of those sorts of things. So they're confident about regulation. But notice how that's different than empowering a group of people to make that decision, a group of people to draw that line, to decide what is offensive and what is hateful. That's something entirely different, okay? So I'm going to look at two arguments that I think are the strongest arguments in favor of Title IX culture, okay? This is a useful practice. I'm Millian to my core. I believe John Stuart Mill was right. So I'm going to look at the strongest arguments I can find for why we should make that distinction between offensive speech and hate speech, which is part of Title IX culture, and then also that we can suppress some speech in order for marginalized voices to have more market share, if you'll pardon the economic phrase, in the public discourse and in the agora, right? So I'm going to look at two of those. So the first one is Jeremy Waldron. There he is giving the Gifford lectures. How many of you have seen his book, The Harm in Hate Speech? One of two of you. You need to go get this book. You need to read it. It's the strongest argument in favor of hate speech that I have seen, the most articulate, and really the most well-respected right now, at least in my circles, at least. Okay, so now can I get my slide? Okay. Jeremy Waldron, just grab my notes here. Sorry, doing pretty good. Yeah. So Jeremy Waldron defines hate speech. He does a pretty thorough job of cutting out exactly what hate speech is, at least according to him, which is that hate speech is group libel. You all know what libel is, right? Saying something libelous about someone, destroying their reputation or whatever. He thinks that hate speech should be defined as group libel. Libel against a particular marginalized group, whatever group that is. Okay? So hate speech is group libel. And here's his definition of hate speech. Ready? I didn't put it up here. It's not coming up on the screen, but I'm not messing with it. So here it is. Hate speech is expressions that express profound disrespect, hatred, and vilification for members of minority groups. So profound disrespect, hatred, and vilification for members of minority groups. And his paradigm here is a Supreme Court case that I'm going to butcher the name. Again, apologies to vegans and vegetarians. Beauharnais v. Illinois, I think it involves passing out a bunch of leaflets, white supremacist leaflets, during the 1930s in Chicago. And he thinks that we could take that, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, and we can apply it to hate speech and make it campus-wide, in fact, all over the United States. He thinks we can do that sort of thing. And so here's a quote from him. "It is not necessary for us to try to force hate speech regulation into a framework of exceptions to free speech." In other words, we're not going to play the game of trying to get legislation to regulate viewpoints in a way that is consistent with the First Amendment. That's not what we're trying to do, okay? What we're going to do instead is we don't assume that the First Amendment, and I'll add the First Amendment culture, will lead to more truth, democracy, or any other good. Okay, and he thinks he has a pretty good argument. I mean, you'd have to read the book to see it. But he thinks that there is an argument for the fact that it is wrong to, as he quotes, he invokes John Stuart Mill, to think that freedom of speech, that tolerance of all ideas, any sentiment or opinion, will actually lead to more truth, democracy, or any other good. And he may be right. If he is, then the First Amendment culture is certainly in trouble. But as you could guess, I'm probably not so... there it is. I just had to hit the button a number of times. Okay, there we go. Should we be skeptical about regulation? Right? So here's my critique of Jeremy Waldron's argument. First of all, there's a lot of conditions for distinguishing between offensive speech and hate speech. Okay? These are Waldron's, not mine, these are his. He says all of these things would have to be determined in order to make sure that we don't chill speech that we shouldn't. You understand what I mean by chill, right? That we don't suppress speech, get people to self-censor, right? These kinds of things would have to be decided by some authority. All right, here they are. Violation of recognition respect rather than appraisal respect. He takes this from a philosophy professor, Stephen Darwall. Stephen Darwall has this paper about two kinds of respect. You can go Google that one as well. And Darwall says we need to distinguish between recognition respect and appraisal respect. Appraisal respect is, I like you as a person. I can appraise you as a person. Your digestion works. We have the same taste in comic books or movies or whatever, and so I can appraise you, and that's a kind of appraisal respect. He doesn't think that that should ever be an issue. That's what he means by mere offense. I can offend you by saying something about your favorite sports team or something along those lines. But what Darwall says is that recognition respect is about your status as an equal part of society. Right? I don't want to reference too much to Tom's talk because everybody wasn't here, but the idea in Athens that parrhesia was given to people of equal status or higher status. And so the idea with hate speech is that it violates recognition respect. Right? It says that you aren't an equal person. Not that I don't like you or I can say something that offends you, but that you're not of an equal status with everyone else. Second of all, he says we've got to figure out there might be less hateful ways to say the same sentiment could be expressed. Right? You could say things from the alt-right version or issues about immigration in a less disrespectful way than Milo I express my distaste for him by not pronouncing his name correctly. You could do it in different ways, and so the censors, the people that are drawing these lines, the regulators, would have to be able to distinguish between less hateful ways and more hateful ways to say something. That's number two. Racial and religious violations. He's concerned about this. Religious speech sometimes is political, and political speech is sometimes religious. And can we censor hateful political speech without censoring religious speech? Right? So he thinks that we're definitely going to have to make distinctions about those. And has it worked in Europe? Right? So I want to suggest to you just a couple of things with this, my critique of this. So you look at all of these four things. Think about what a regulator is going to have to do, whether that's a Title IX administrator who's doing an investigation, whether that's a student council that has to decide whether or not to punish some sort of student for an infraction involving speech or whatever. They've got to decide whether it's recognition respect or appraisal respect. They've got to decide is there less hateful ways to say the same sentiment. They've got to decide if it's really racial or religious or if it's just political. They've got to do all of those sorts of things. And I want to suggest to you that there is a good reason that we will get this wrong. And by getting it wrong, I don't mean the government. One of the things that bothers me about Waldron is when it comes to the regulators, who watches the watchman, right? Who is the one who's going to decide? Waldron says, well, I understand the objection, and it's that the government has its own agenda, and the government is going to push its agenda, and it's going to do all these sorts of things. And I'm suggesting to you, I'm not worried about the government regulating speech. I'm worried about any group of people randomly regulating speech, whoever they are. Because if you look at the social psychology literature, we are just chock full of biases, all of us. We are really, really chock full of biases. I think there's 32 in Daniel Kahneman's book. 32 biases. Here's Rationality and Reflective Mind by Keith Stanovich, where Stanovich talks about our intuitions, which he calls System 1, and our deep deliberative thinking, which he calls System 2. And it turns out that System 1 is lazy. System 1 doesn't really look at those kinds of distinctions I'm talking about. So not only that, you got to pick regulators that are really good at deliberation. So that's going to be a problem. Furthermore, Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And one of the interesting things he says is that things like politics and religion bind and blind. That is, they bind us all together, but they also have the evolutionary side effect of also blinding us to particular distinctions and differences wherever they are. Here's another article from The Atlantic, How Concept Creep Made Americans So Sensitive to Harm. And it turns out that sociological literature, social psychology literature seems to indicate that ideas and concepts that were thought very, very strong divided line between abuse, verbal abuse, and physical abuse, all of these different divided lines over the years creep. They creep and they get expanded. And so then we have verbal abuse, then we have emotional abuse. And as they creep, some creeping is probably good. Scientific progress probably involves concept creep to an extent. But as it expands, so does the difficulty in distinguishing between them. So I want to be clear here. I am not saying that the government is really bad at regulating speech. I am saying that, but I'll say that in a different talk. What I'm saying is that any group of people would be bad at regulating speech. I want to convince you that any group of people trying to draw these lines, trying to define these terms, to distinguish between recognition, respect, and appraisal respect, between religious speech and political speech, between policies about capitalism and policies about repression, that anybody who does that in a group is going to be bad at it because humans are the kinds of critters we are. Okay? That's my point. So that's the reason why I think Waldron is, you should be skeptical about Waldron's claim about dividing between offensive and hateful, right? That's why I think you should be skeptical. How about the Title IX culture's skepticism of tolerance? Well, if there's one person who has really articulated that well, the strongest argument, in my opinion, comes from Herbert Marcuse. Sorry, let me get that right. Get it right. Herbert Marcuse. And Herbert Marcuse wrote an essay entitled Repressive Tolerance. Repressive Tolerance. How many of you have read it? You've read Repressive Tolerance? 2 people. Okay? You should read it. For postmodern philosophy, and I'm an analytic philosopher, so I'm on the other team. For postmodern philosophy, it's remarkably clear and very, very logical. Okay? So here's what Marcuse says. He really turns the table on John Stuart Mill. He says, tolerance strengthens the tyranny of the majority. That's what he says. So John Stuart Mill talks about the tyranny of the majority. He's worried about the mass of society, right, censoring opinions and those kinds of things. And here's what he says. He says that tolerance, this 1A culture of tolerating all these viewpoints, what that does is strengthen the status quo. And of course, the status quo is capitalist and white and privileged and powerful and money and all of those sorts of things. And so tolerance really just strengthens the tyranny of the majority. Here's another statement. Liberating tolerance would then mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Now notice, packed into that statement are two claims. One is epistemic. You know what epistemic is, right? Epistemology, study knowledge, right? It says we can know which claims are from the right and which claims are from the left. That's number one. We can know it. And then second of all, a moral claim that we should repress the right and bolster the left. Okay? Two claims there, one epistemic, one. All right? Here's another quote. This means that previously neutral, value-free, formal aspects of learning and teaching now become in their own right political. That's the reason why. It took a few years. He wrote this in 1968, but we're here, right? All of the aspects of learning and teaching are now in their own right political. Science is political, right? There is nothing that doesn't meet the political because there is nothing that doesn't either bolster the status quo, white, capitalist, rich, or is undermining it in one way or another. So how do I want to respond to Marcuse? How do I want to respond to this claim? Well, first of all, Marcuse's epistemic claim is really strong. You read the essay. He really does think that we can distinguish between right and left, hate and mere oppression, or mere satire. How about satire and comedy? How about all of those things? We can distinguish between them enough that come the revolution, we can suppress those things so that other views can come forward. I think we're entitled to be skeptical that Title IX culture will regulate without serious concept creep. In fact, everything in social psychology literature that I've read, and granted I am a novice in this area, seems to indicate that we suck at making those distinctions. We're lousy at it. Small groups of us are lousy at it, a little bit better. Big groups really suck at it. Large organizations are really bad at drawing those kinds of claims. Second of all, isn't Marcuse's moral claim about freeing tolerance undermined by his Marxist commitments? Not to say anything about Marxism in and of itself. I mean, I'm happy to say lots of things about Marxism, but at this point, what I mean by that is the position is a lot stronger if I don't have to buy into the Marxist commitments in order to buy into the program of repressing some speech so that other speech can come about. But Marcuse is really clear that the only way this works is if we suppress capitalism, right? And it's a Marxist critique of capitalism, even though he himself considered himself a new Marxist, right? And he didn't buy into the labor theory of value and some other stuff like that. But the point is that you have to hold to his Marxist commitments. That is, that society is primarily driven by the economic, right? And that everything is political and economic in that sense, and it's a zero-sum game. Now, I can critique that all day long if you want to, but my point is this. It's not just a negative claim, right? One more book for you to go and pick up. The Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. Mark Bray is an academic. He teaches at Dartmouth University. He wrote a book called The Anti-Fascist Handbook. Really interesting. The moment it came out, I was like, I'm a good million. I need to go read this. And I devoured his book in one night. And the interesting thing about the Anti-Fascist Handbook, he makes clear right from the beginning, is that anti-fascism is not just against fascism. It is very much a positive claim, and that positive claim is some form of socialism. Some form of socialism. So I'm all right to debate that, but I just want you to be clear about the fact that if you're going to buy into Title IX culture, at least as Marcuse expresses it, and as Antifa is presenting it, you're going to also have to buy into the Marxist underpinnings. And that's a big epistemic debt. There's a lot of work you got to do before you can do that and be justified. Which brings me to my last slide. John Stuart Mill. When I was casting about for a doctoral dissertation, by the way, how much time do I have? 0 minutes? Oh, gosh. Jeez, I didn't realize. I thought maybe I had read it wrong. I'm sorry. When I was casting about for doctoral dissertation, I came upon this passage of John Stuart Mill. I'm not a utilitarian. I don't think utilitarianism is right. But I came across this passage. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, those who dissent from the opinion, still more than those who hold it. And I look at that last part, I'm trying to figure out, why does Mill think that if we silence an opinion, it robs the people who can dissent more than the people who are speaking? That the real victims in censorship are the people who want to dissent. And then I read his other quote. In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has he become so? Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct, because it has been his practice to listen to all that can be said against it, to profit by as much of it as was just, and to expound to himself and upon occasion to others the fallacy of what is fallacious. 3 activities: critical attention to other viewpoints, critical adjustment of your own viewpoints when you are confronted with ideas that you don't like, and critical exposition, that is thinking out loud amongst other people and disagreeing. All 3 of those activities are threatened by censorship, and no dividing line between hate and offense will get us there. That is my claim to you. We ought to be skeptical about Title IX culture, not Title IX, Title IX culture. We ought to be skeptical about anybody who says that group of people should be deciding which viewpoints are acceptable and which are not. Thank you very much.
And now short comments from our panelists.
Thanks so much. So much in there. I've had my say this morning. So when you're talking about concept creep, I think that's actually very real. That what starts off as a legitimate, maybe a legitimate concern about something ends up diffusing so much that it starts to cover more and more territory. And the way it usually plays out is that, and this is how I try to explain it, you could make society completely safe if you wanted to, from speech, from physical harm, whatever. You could eradicate murder, you could eradicate offense, you could eradicate harm. You just would have to lock everybody up, put them all in solitary confinement. So you can have an optimal state of safety where nothing bad happens, 0 bad things happen. The problem is, in a free society, you have to tolerate something, quote unquote, bad happening that's greater than 0. It's an economist argument, really, that you have to tolerate a certain amount of bad stuff in order to get the good stuff. And I think that leads to the Marcuse thing. I'll just say a word about him. And this is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. It's a good time to go back and read what happened. It's being praised by some people and vilified by other people. I tend to be in the second category. Because the rhetoric of Marcuse, who was an heir to that revolution, he was a Marxist, revolutionary, German Jewish Marxist who escaped from Hitler and had supported the Bolshevik line, but was upset that the revolution didn't turn out the way it did. But his line on speech is basically the same line as Lenin, that you wouldn't give your enemies weapons, so why would you give them free speech? And the point I'd like you to maybe address is, and I think we see it now, is that his kind of arguments where you get to repress somebody in order so you can speak, that invariably leads to violence. Invariably. You're talking about taking away other people's rights, and you're actually saying that you're going to do that. The next logical step is violence, and I think the Berkeley riots are a perfect example of that. These people who were rioting in the streets, destroying property, burning things, they were inspired by Marcusean arguments. He's in some ways the intellectual godfather of the alt-left. And I just wanted to make that point, that it sounds great, repress the right, enhance the left, but when you talk about repressing people rhetorically, it can be very few steps to when you actually do violence against them. And this has always been a problem with Marxism in general. I just wanted to see it.
Yep. Do I respond now, or do I wait? Huh?
As you like.
As I like. Okay, as I like it. Okay. Yeah, so in the study that FIRE did, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education did, it was a very small percentage of students that believed that abusive speech was violence, and therefore it was acceptable to use violence if, in prevention of it. About 4%. But 4% can spoil it for everybody, honestly. And I'm always reminded of the very chilling sort of statement after the Middlebury with Charles Murray, when a student said they didn't want to shut it down, so we shut it down for them. And so students are expecting, in this culture, according to the data that's out there on the surveys, students are confident that regulators, that universities can regulate speech. They can regulate hate versus offense. And they can do all of this sort of stuff. And if they don't do it, there's a very, very small group of people who will do it for them. And that's where you get the kind of shouting down arguments and all that sort of stuff, and then a smaller version of those that will actually engage in violence. Now, to be fair, you know, after I read Mark Bray's The Anti-Fascist Handbook, I got it. I got it in ways that I didn't get it before. The folks that are willing to use violence really genuinely believe that they are the last line of defense against fascism. And it has to be stopped in its infancy before it makes it to the levels of power. And so one response from, or one quote from the book is, you use words so you don't have to use fists. You use fists so you don't have to use knives. You use knives so you don't have to use guns. You use guns so you don't have to use tanks. And I get it. I really do. I think it's mistaken, but I understand the passion and I understand the sentiment involved. But I find it, what's interesting is that the libertarian movements, particularly Baldy Harper, who is with IHS, who founded the Institute for Humane Studies, felt exactly the same way about communism. That the universities were the last line of defense against communism right after World War II. And yet, there wasn't this kind of take up arms kind of idea. So I think that there has to be dialogue there, but I think that we really do have to realize that there are people who think that they are the last line of defense against fascism. And they're not really great at figuring out necessarily what a fascist is. And figuring out. But once you're labeled a fascist, you no longer get to talk. You're not allowed. Fascism, first quote in Mark Bray's book is, fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed. And God help us all if we are the ones that are labeled a fascist, even if you're not one. I'm writing an essay right now called, You're 100% Sure You're Not a Fascist, and You're Being No Platformed, right? I'm 100% sure I'm not a fascist. And yet if I get labeled one, then there's no talking to me anymore. They won't talk to me anymore. If I am wrong about being fascist, I'd really like to know it. But if I can't be spoken to, if all I can do is be punched in the mouth, then that is the lowest and narrowest form of protest.
I'll kind of be brief with my comments here. One particular thing that you asked, you kind of asked a rhetorical question, but I am going to answer it, and is, should we be skeptical of regulation? And as an economist, my ears kind of pop up because it's a resounding yes. We should be skeptical. We honestly believe in econ that if you want the most superior outcome, it is to allow the free flow of ideas. You have to allow agents, individuals, to come together and figure things out. That's how you get the best signals, and that's how you get the best incentives. And Title IX culture, as you have presented it, using that word culture at the end, is one that's restrictive, is one that is putting in a lot of regulation. And for me as an economist, once you put that regulation there, the outcome you're going to get is going to be inferior. The outcome you're going to get is one that's highly inefficient. So should we be skeptical of regulation? You weren't asking us to answer the question, but I will. I say yes.
So Yeah, and I really appreciate this. This is a kind of a public choice critique of free speech that I'm trying to do. Public choice economics says that the kinds of incentives that are involved in business, the kinds of economic incentives also apply to government. They also apply to regulation and those sorts of things. And I just want to, just one quick comment, which is this, that we tend to think of censorship as just kind of like putting a black label over something, like it does it, we block it, like it's not there, we don't get to see that it's there anymore. And I don't like the term censorship. I use it to be provocative, but I like the term regulation, because you're not going to completely block it. You're not going to completely get rid of it. All you're going to do is regulate the flow of it in one place or another. And I think, at least my critique of Waldron, and I'll go to Elizabeth's, one of her colleagues, whom I don't, Dalmia, I think her name? Yeah, Shika Dalmia, makes the point that Waldron says that the United States should be more like Europe in its hate speech laws, but she also presents a lot of compelling evidence that hate speech, hatred, fascism is far worse in Europe than it is in the United States. And I actually have data to back that up. I got from the Anti-Defamation League that all 14 major countries in Europe are far more anti-Semitic than the United States is, even though they have really strong anti-Semitic laws, these sorts of things. So I ended that one slide with, has it worked in Europe? And I think it's pretty good. I could make a very good case, and I will listen with patience to anyone who disagrees, but I could make a very good case that it hasn't worked, that Europe is far more fascist and far more racist and sexist than the United States in that regard. I know that goes against the narrative, but I think I've got some data to back that up. And so, yeah, I think that regulation, we ought to be skeptical in that regard. Okay, Liz, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I just wanted to comment on some of the things you said at the end about how if you buy into Title IX culture and if you buy into anti-fascist culture, or Antifa as it's often called these days, that you have to buy into their Marxist underpinnings. Because I find that that's also the same thing for feminism and for the feminist movement, the modern feminist movement. There's a whole lot of it. There's a major faction of it, or maybe even most of it, that sort of says, if you are a feminist, you have to be anti-capitalist, you have to believe in raising the minimum wage to this level, you have to believe in universal health care and all of these things. At the Women's March this year in January, that was, there was a platform of all the things that they believed in, and they were like, please don't come if you are anti-abortion, please don't come if you are pro-sex worker rights, but also like, please don't come if you don't support the minimum wage and all this stuff. And so it's very frustrating, because you'll talk to people and they'll say, do you believe that men and women should be equal before the law? And you'll say yes, and they'll be like, you're a feminist. And you're like, great, I'm a feminist. And they're like, do you believe, we should raise the minimum wage to $25? And I'm like, no. And they're like, you're not, how can you call yourself a feminist then? So I think we see a lot of the same thing of that. And so for, a long time I was very hesitant to associate with feminism at all. But I've discovered in the past couple of years libertarian feminism and the libertarian feminist movement, and actually just recently launched a group called Feminists for Liberty, which is sort of devoted to spreading those ideals. And it's very much devoted to the idea that a lot of the issues that the modern feminist movement identifies are actually issues that we should address and we should talk about and try to find solutions to, but that this sort of like tendency to go straight for regulations, straight for banning speech, straight for sort of all these sort of Marxist tendencies is not actually necessary for feminism, and actually not really, it's pretty antithetical to the goals, I think. So, but yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so just two quick comments on that. First of all, you see the concept creep, right?
Yeah.
You see the concept creep. We start off, it's supposed to be, do you believe in gender equity, these sort of things. And then it becomes, well, then you also have to be in favor of the minimum wage, because there's a premise in there about one leading to the other. And but it's an unstated premise. It's what Aristotle called an enthymeme, right? It's there, and so you get that concept creep. The second thing is, I think there's a lot of sociological data that seems to indicate that in-group bias is a heck of a drug. I mean, it really is, and we're really, really good at deciding who's in the inside and who's in the outside. I really love that essay. I started reading the essay that you were talking about by Merton about insiders and outsiders. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Questions from our audience?
Okay, yes. Hello.
I'm so glad you got the mic first. Go ahead.
Oh, no. Sorry, I'll keep my question brief. You spoke of virtue ethics, and I think in doing so, considering tolerance as a virtue may lead to a possible defense of Title IX culture, in the sense that, like any good Aristotelian would, we're aiming for that golden mean, and they might say that tolerance in the 1A culture is perhaps an excess, where in operating in that excess, that tolerance is not just a negative claim of simply ignoring, but rather it's a positive claim of perhaps consent of belonging in the conversation or in the discourse, which they may determine to be harmful. And I think one of those harms, we might say, leads to some sort of ethical obligation to protect, not namely the freedom of speech, but the freedom to speak, where you have persons or group of persons, because of the discourse and because of the status quo of 1A culture, feel like this excess of tolerance is preventing them to speak. And I guess the general question is, in protecting freedom of speech, are we also obligated to protect a person's freedom to speak in any situation?
Right. So let me address the Aristotelian question second, because I'll get really excited about talking about Aristotle, so that'll be fun. But let me deal with the second one. So I want to resist, because words are important, I want to resist the claim that you want to distinguish between free speech and the freedom to speak. Okay? Because I don't agree with Title IX culture's idea that the cartoon with the big giant megaphone. I could go into a lot of detail with regard to this, but I don't agree with that, especially in an age of Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and all the others, where something can go viral when you have absolutely no power whatsoever. So I want to resist the term freedom to speak. But let's get to the Aristotelian question, because I think this is a really good one, okay? Because I wrote my dissertation on it, so oh boy. All right, everybody buckle in. One of the virtues that I spent a lot of time talking about, that I've spent a lot of time in my life dealing with, was intellectual virtue. And intellectual virtue requires that human beings have justified opinions, okay? So that's the Aristotelian part of that claim, right? Aristotle talks about intellectual virtue, and we have to have intellectual virtue to have eudaimonia, to have flourishing, right? And I wrote a paper basically defending a perfectionist, that is an Aristotelian perfectionist defense of free speech, where I argued from intellectual virtue to justified opinions through Mill's understanding of these three critical activities to free speech. That regulating speech undermines those three critical activities, which then in turn undermines intellectual virtue, which then undermines eudaimonia. And Aristotle was no fan of free speech, of course. He was all for, lots of regulation. But I think that you could find within an Aristotelian idea this kind of tolerance as this kind of virtue. And as for the idea of a golden mean, remember Aristotle didn't think everything had not every virtue had a mean, right? Justice didn't, and some other things. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that tolerance may be one of those, like justice in that regard. Good question, though, Dar.
Okay. So thank you for the talk. Very stimulating. Can't we agree with your premise that we should be skeptical of regulation while simultaneously thinking that it actually is a necessity? Again, parallel to market regulation. We should obviously be skeptical of anyone who wants to claim a market, because it could be abused, it could be misused, regulatory capture, all those sorts of problems, but still saying that the solution to that problem isn't just complete unregulated markets, which demonstrably leads to market failure, but rather we need to have sort of institutional skepticism and criticism of the actual regulators. And so, with regard to the System 1, System 2, we can recognize these sorts of biases, and there's sort of proven demonstrable work within empirical psychology of ways to de-bias people. And
really?
Yeah.
We found, because everything that I looked for, I didn't see anybody, there was lots of talk about de-biasing, but there didn't seem to be any method that yielded good results.
We can compare notes after.
Yeah, let's
on
do
that.
that.
But in principle, at least, it seems to me
Oh, I agree, in
an
principle.
intellectually defensible position to say, yes, we should be skeptical, but we should also recognize it as necessary.
Okay, so there's two ideas here. So the first one is, couldn't we regulate the marketplace of ideas the way that we regulate markets, right? And yes, we should be skeptical of regulation, but we still allow regulation. Well, notice what kind of regulation we allow in markets. We try, well, at least I should say we should allow in markets. Things like regulating monopolies. I've argued that I don't think that there is, I'm skeptical of the idea that free speech works in the same way that market share does in that regard. We also regulate force and fraud, right? And I think you already have that in 1A culture. So I'm not sure what Title IX culture could add to that. And third of all, we tend to think of a free marketplace as one where there's no barriers to entry, right? And it is a spontaneous order. It has norms, but there's no one planner involved in it. And so I will say this, I think there should be regulation of speech. I think there should be time, place, and manner restrictions, sure. But here's the thing that I resist strongly, which is that and this is Mill's point. Mill allows for time, place, and manner restrictions, right? He allows for lots of those kinds of restrictions. What he doesn't allow is so what he wants is an unregulated, an environment of unregulated sentiment and opinion. There has to be places where there should never be a situation in which a viewpoint is anathema. It should never be spoken, right? And I worry very strongly about this, right? I mean, you can't even make the use mention distinction anymore, right? So I encountered this for the first time when I was in graduate school. We were reading out of a textbook, and the professor was scared to death to use a word that means stingy because it sounds like the N word. Okay, you can go look up the word. I'm not going to say it because I'm scared too. Because I'm in Title IX culture. I mean, it's everywhere. So I'm worried about that, and I don't want anybody to get triggered. I'm a nice guy, and so you can't even make the use mention distinction. There were people at Facebook that were censored for talking about fascism because of the terms that they used, and they were anti-fascist, but they were using the term. So we can't even distinguish between use and mention. So I'm really going to be skeptical of any group of people being able to do the kinds of regulations that regulate viewpoints. So I will listen with patience to people who want to talk about time, place, and manner restrictions, right? I want time, place, and manner restrictions, particularly time restrictions, because I don't mind people protesting me. I just don't want them to do it while I'm talking, right? I want them to do it afterwards, right? Or I want them to do it simultaneously someplace else. I mean, God bless them, absolutely. But not in the middle of my talk. So I do want time, place, and manner restrictions. I mean, I could even allow for content regulation in the sense that there are certain places we don't talk about certain things, right? But there has to be some place where we could talk about anything. Otherwise, we end up with no justified opinions. We really honestly I can't say that I think fascists are evil knuckleheads if I am at the same time saying that they can't speak. I'm not justified in my position anymore. That's Mill's point, right? Good question.
All right, so my first question has to do with your definition of hate.
I can't hear you. Can you? Yeah.
All right, we got it. So.
Oh, yeah, now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me. Good. My first question has to do with your definition of hate speech. So
Sure.
I'll recap it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think I got it pretty accurately. You define hate speech as expressions that express profound disrespect, hatred, vilification for members of minority groups.
That is Jeremy Waldron's definition of hate speech.
The definition you gave us, yes.
Yep.
Not your definition.
I'm
Thank you.
quoting him, yeah.
Correct. So I guess I had a question about that because that definition seems racist to me. It's
Oh, I want to hear this. Go ahead.
It's like I said, maybe I'm wrong, but profound disrespect.
I'll let you know if you are. Go ahead.
Hatred, vilification for members of minority groups. So if I was to take like your panel up there, we got 3 white people and 1 lovely black lady, but only the black person can regulate like hate speech against the group, like basically you can only so you can't hate against white people, basically is what it comes down to.
Okay, yeah. So Waldron definitely does not believe that hate speech applies to the majority or the position that's in power and privilege. So yes, that is
seems
his
very
definition.
problematic, does it not?
I think the whole idea of trying to define hate speech is problematic. So I'm not sure.
But to break it down to race, and now you're giving certain groups power over others to determine what hate speech is, which is subjective anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your question is because, I mean,
I just
is
don't
it,
like the definition at all.
Oh, okay, all right.
But okay, so we'll move on.
Yeah, I don't like I don't like his definition either, but probably for different reasons.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you. So and then next, so you basically recommended us the anti-fascist handbook.
Yep,
Yeah. So
you ought to read it.
are you aware that Antifa and anti-fascism was deemed a terrorist group last August
By who?
by the United States?
Okay, by the United States, like the United States government?
Yes, sir. It's on the
But
White
not
House.
like the Southern Poverty Law Center.
You can go to whitehouse.gov and it
Oh,
says
okay.
on
All right.
August 17th, 2017.
I wasn't aware that that was the
recognized
case.
as a
What does
terrorist
that-
organization?
The FBI declared it like
A hate
a hate group.
Okay.
But they've also declared the band ICP a hate group and Black Lives Matter, and just like they declare a lot of groups of people hate
Yeah.
groups. So, or terrorist.
I just thought it was weird for you to recommend that. I mean, everything that I've
Well,
seen, I don't know what anybody else has seen from
Okay,
Antifa, but
why would it
you're-
be weird for me to recommend a book by a scholar who is attempting to present a viewpoint? If I'm going to rail against Antifa, and I will, don't worry. I mean, I'll argue at the drop of a hat, and I'll drop the hat. I will. Don't I deserve? I mean, don't they deserve for me to know what they believe? Shouldn't
We
I
should. No, we should.
understand their position?
we should definitely be educated on it.
Oh, good.
100% agree.
Okay.
I just wanted to bring it up because it just kind of was like, oh, whoa,
Yeah.
the terrorist group. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Can I jump in here real quick and just
Yeah,
say,
go ahead.
that I would recommend that everyone sort of look carefully at what that means when the FBI or various people declare things hate groups, because it generally is,
It goes for the Southern Poverty Law Center too.
yeah, it's, or a terrorist organization. But I mean, it's the same classification. I don't know if you guys know the band ICP, like they paint their face and they like metal and Fago soda.
Insane Clown
and,
Posse? Is it
Insane
Insane
Clown
Clown
Posse,
Posse?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same thing that they have been declared. So it's not exactly a super serious designation. Just wanted to make sure everyone knows that.
All right. So my question is.
Where are you? Let me see. Oh, there you. Okay, go ahead.
Right here. So basically, your speech is about Title X and culture and 1A culture clashing in regards to college campuses. So I think a vital part of college campuses nowadays is the internet, social media, and we see how fast you're talking about things going viral. How does a college campus or companies like Google or Facebook or Twitter, how do they approach free speech on the internet? Should it be a 1A approach or a Title IX approach?
Okay, so the question is, can we regulate the internet the way we regulate college campuses? So I'm going to just say, from a feasibility point of view, I don't think you could. The further question is, should we? I like to answer these questions with more freedom, not less. And I think, so first of all, I don't think you could. Number two, I don't think we should. Okay, or? Well, the 1A route's already going on, right? It's already, I mean.
Facebook's trying to figure that out, so it's not necessarily 1A, but they're trying to censor like certain maybe free or fake stories.
Right. So your question is about what Facebook. So big platforms like Facebook, or I can't remember the guy that was concerned about this recently. Oh man, I cannot remember. Some platform, some app somewhere that was concerned about regulation of viewpoints and this sort of thing. I mean, I think we should go the 1A route. I think that there should be time, place, and manner restrictions, but I don't think there should ever be a restriction on, say, viewpoints, right? I don't think any viewpoint should be restricted. That would have to include Facebook, too. So. And the good thing about Facebook is I can just unfriend you, and I don't have to listen to you at all.
That's the point. You can walk
Right.
away.
I can walk away from that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm an Italian citizen. I just wanted to point out, I'm Italian.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to point out that we don't prevent people to talk about fascism. The only thing the law says, you cannot try to remake the fascist party.
Mhm.
That's the only thing you're not allowed to do. So you can say fascism was good, but the moment you say, let's make it again, then that becomes illegal.
So what
So-
if I wanted to talk about the fascist party as a good thing in history?
You can. You can. The only thing you cannot do is try to remake it right now. Reinstate it right now.
Like have a march or something?
No, like try to reorganize it.
Oh,
Try
like
to-
like actually make a
well,
party.
actually make
Oh,
an
okay.
organization under
Well,
the
that's
name.
certainly
Fas-
better than Germany, where an individual just recently was convicted because he made a complimentary statement about Hitler in a private message. Yeah.
Yeah,
but-
like talking about Europe, you getting a lot of realities together.
Mhm.
I think the reason why Germany is so strong is because that's where it happened. And
Well, but Italy was where fascism, right? I mean, Mussolini's fascism came in, right? I mean, am I right? Okay. So it's not as strong, right? Oh, I'm the data that I'm referring to are studies by the Anti-Defamation League that says that Europe as a whole, the 14 major states of Europe, is more anti-Semitic, that is anti-Jewish, than the United States. So you could disagree with their data if you'd like. I could show it to you if you want to see it. But yeah. But that's not what? Uh-huh. But so your claim is, if I understand you correctly, hey, we're not that anti-free speech over in Europe, especially in Italy, right? We're not that anti-free speech. Well, no, I just thought you were referring to my data that I was suggesting. I freely defer to you when you say that Italy is not as anti-free speech as other parts of Europe. I freely defer to you since you're from Italy. Okay, I thought you were questioning my statement. My claim was about what hate speech laws have done in Europe as a whole. Okay, all right, thanks.
Hi. So it seems to me from most of the things that I see online and hear from people I know that this culture is really growing on college campuses. I don't know if you guys know what happened to Evergreen College a while ago.
Uh-huh.
I've also heard of professors who are afraid to voice how they actually feel in fear of their students turning on them, and in the case of Evergreen, them actually getting fired for it. Do you think that there's a solution for this on college campuses, or is this something that's just going to kind of have to slow burn and fade out?
So the question is, do I think there's a solution for the pervasive idea that professors are self-censoring? Not without there being something done to the levers with regard to Title IX, right? I mean, as long as the costs of not complying with Title IX, and that's just any student complaining to the Office of Civil Rights that they didn't take my complaint seriously. I'm concerned about this. And that has with it the lever that we could take away your federal funding. I don't think that there is going to be any change with regard to that. You also said, or is it just going to have to burn itself out? I'm not convinced that it's going to burn itself out. Absolutely.
Can I make a point of information about the Title IX? And that was the Title IX. The Title IX culture was enabled by, and you talk about institutions, by the Obama administration, Department of Office of Civil Rights. They wrote a Dear Colleague letter saying that they were going to expand the idea of what constituted sexual harassment, and that put a tremendous chill in higher education. So with the end of the Obama administration, that is decidedly, I know this, from the inside, at least from the Department of Education, they're unpacking that. They're walking that back now and trying to put Title IX back where it originally started, which is to really regulate sexual harassment, not some mistake that a professor might make in a class in a lecture, by showing, say, a female breast or something, and have it being taken out of context. They're trying. So I just wanted to put that point of information that with the new administration, there's a decided movement against the way that Title IX was interpreted in the Obama administration.
And the idea, though, I just mentioned that these are referring to the Dear Colleague letters. You can go read all of them. They're these letters that go out that are attempts to figure out how to regulate the policy that's already in place. And so this administration has tried to walk back that some, but every Title IX administrator that I talk to seems to feel like everything's kind of in flux, and they don't know what's going to happen and where it's going to go and all that sort of stuff. So.
I just had a question about a comment that was made about in a free society you have to tolerate a certain amount of bad stuff when it leads to the good. My question was, if we know that the harms of free, unregulated speech fall disproportionately on certain groups and benefit disproportionately other groups, how can we justify that?
Okay, so the claim, the question, correct me if I'm wrong, let me see if I get it right. So I didn't make the claim that we have to tolerate. Tom gets to answer that, to write on that idea of tolerance, because I'm not going to make a consequentialist argument. That is, I'm not going to argue that free speech is good because of its consequences, right? Because I'm pretty skeptical about the consequences of free speech, right? And so your claim is, so suppose that we know that the harms of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, so to speak, falls disproportionately on marginalized voices or small voices, then how could we be justified? Well, my claim is that if we grab the lever of regulation and we begin to silence certain voices in order that other voices can have more say, then we lose our moral high ground. That's my claim. We are no longer as justified in saying they are evil knuckleheads, right? They're evil or whatever. We're not, because we start marginalizing those other voices, we don't know. I mean, someone was concerned because I suggested that you read a book by a tenured faculty member at Dartmouth that has a view, and he clearly is, in favor of the revolution. I mean, he wants society to be upended. He says, if you think no platform is rough, wait till you get class warfare. That's his direct quote from him, right? Wait till they hear about class warfare. I mean, he's an anarcho-socialist. And people are concerned about that. I mean, I wouldn't be justified in saying as passionately the things that I want to say about him if I don't let him speak. And more importantly, if I don't expose myself to their viewpoints. So in answer to your question, I don't think we would be morally justified once we grab that lever of regulation.
Another answer that to that too is that when you give the government the power to do certain regulations, even if you generally if you look at the history of any of this sort of stuff in this country or other countries, when you give the government more power to regulate speech, it will inevitably end up harming the most vulnerable people. Because even though we think, like, okay, we're going to use this against these, these people who are in this dominant group, it never works that way in practice, because power changes, because the people tasked with enforcing the laws are just ordinary people. And so giving them more power to crack down on speech actually harms marginalized voices more in practice, I think, than not.
Because the same levers that you put in place, and I think you're absolutely right. The same levers that you put in place can be used as long as you have a different administration, different administration. I mean, it was amazing to me that people were decrying all of the worries about the Trump administration and its authoritarianism, while at the exact same time we're arguing that we should have more control and more regulation of hate speech. I mean, we're just one administration away from your particular viewpoint being turned on.
Thank you. So just thinking through this, playing this forward, I think you said there was like a small group of, let's say a really small group of students who are happy about the levers being in place, or whatever group, and there's a super small group that's violent about it when the levers don't do the job. So if these levers are walked back, right, and they go away, what happens then? What's the remedy for the people who want the levers to be there? And is there any concern? Well, at least I might have a concern that that group, that small group that decides to get violent, figures they need to get more people. What do campuses do without the levers of Title IX, even if they're not working? I mean, there's still going to be people pissed off about speech.
Yeah, so if I understand your question, it's like, so what do we do? What do those people who are already committed, say, to violence, because abusive speech is violence, so we ought to be able, the reciprocity says we should also respond violently if we have to. What happens if 1A culture wins, right? Something about Title IX, and I somehow wave my magic wand and we're all free speech absolutists again. Those people aren't going to be, right? What's going to happen to them? I think the same thing that happens to all violent outlying groups, right? They will say, yes, we want to have more members, right? But they find it's very, very difficult to do that, right? The Ku Klux Klan is an organization that has a hard time getting members, right? I know it doesn't look like that on the news, but it's true. There's a lot of data that indicates it's very hard for them to do it. Why? Because people aren't willing to take that step, whatever it is. And I would hope the same thing would apply to Antifa. It's mine. Right? But it's going to be hearts and minds, man. I mean, it's going to be hearts and minds. It's not going to be. I'm not in favor of. If any of you are thinking I'm in favor of, like, regulating their viewpoints, nope. You can't hit anybody. That's not allowed. No, but yeah, of course you could protest and dress up like ninjas if you want to. It's fine. I'm okay with that. We might want to keep these away from the alt-right people and people like Richard Spencer, but I don't want to regulate their viewpoints either. That's why I wanted you to read his book. I want you to know what their view is. I don't want you to agree with it. I just want you to read it.
With that, the conventional thing to do at the end of a session is to clap your hands together.